All right, I have it's 1 o'clock, but we'll try and give it just a few more minutes. If you haven't already, please fill out our poll questions just so that we can get to know you all a little bit better, sort of what your experience level is, and then in the future, tailor some of what we're going to be talking about to all of you who are joining and where you're at in your specific questions. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, we do have you all muted right now. If you do have questions at the end of the webinar, we will be coming off mute and you can have a chance to ask your question then. If at any point you have a question during the webinar, feel free to type them in the chat and we will try and address the questions as they come up. And then what we're doing to help get started is if you're willing, please type your name into the chat. I guess I don't need your name because I have it with you signed in, but a little bit more about yourself. What's your interest in digesters or what brought you here today? Are you a farmer? Are you a crop producer? Are you a regulator, et cetera, to sort of understand who the audience is. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, this one is going to be really more of the basics. What are digesters? How do they function? And as we go through this series, hopefully we'll get a little bit more complex, especially if you have questions about costs or economies of scale. We will address that in pretty great detail next time about what it takes to make a project cash flow and how to get there, or at least some ideas or things that people have tried to find that economy of scale. And we'll finish up talking about biomass digestion and why people may be interested in that in a following one. Today will really be just a general, how do digesters function? What are some of the things that they offer and how would we think about putting one on a farm and how might it change how a farm is operated and managed? And thank you for everyone who's typing in what they do. Great to have you here and learn a little bit more about what you all have going on. A wastewater engineer, great to have you here, Paul. Certainly the on-farm version of this is going to be a little different and interested to talk to you more sometime about what you do and what the potential for some co-substrates are. I think since it's a little after 1 now, we're going to give it about 2 more minutes and then we'll get started. So if you haven't yet, please do try and answer those poll questions for us. If you're willing, type into the chat a little bit about yourself. Okay, as we get a little bit closer, thanks to everyone for completing those poll questions. Super helpful. I see we have a very diverse crowd, but a lot of people at least somewhat familiar with biogas digesters. So hopefully this will teach you a little something. And if not, the future ones where we dive into some of the cost structures and talk about maybe what it takes to hit economies of scale will certainly be of interest to you. As we keep going, if you are willing, please write your name in the chat and tell us a little bit more of yourself about yourself. That's extremely helpful for getting to know our audience. With that, a little logistics for today. I'm Dan Andersen. I'm an associate professor and extension specialist at Iowa State University, and my world deals primarily with livestock manures, and that's how I come about in anaerobic digestion. Kapil Arora will be joining us and giving one of the presentations today on benefits of anaerobic digestion. He is an area engineer in north central Iowa for Iowa State University. And then Melissa and Rachel helped set everything up today. So big props for them for helping make sure that all the technical details of the meeting are carried on, and that it got on your calendar when you registered. And they'll help with monitoring the chat to make sure we don't miss a question. So if you can do that, that would all be greatly appreciated. So with that, I think we're going to get started. So the first presentation today is going to be an intro to anaerobic digestion, just talking about the basic science and how it applies to trying to install digesters on farms, especially on livestock farms. So I think one of the places to really start here, and I like to say we're not in Kansas anymore, right? And we're a world from maybe going to black and white to trying to live in color. And at least given the state of Iowa, where we have so much pig production, and we think about all the nutrient value we get from manure, where we can obtain about 30% of all the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium we need from livestock manures. Historically, that's been worth in the neighborhood of about $25 per pig space per year in trying to capture that fertilizer value. And at first blush, that seems like not terrible money, right? It's a lot of work to sort of chase that. It takes a good level of sophistication, knowing what your fields need, trying to get it on at the right time. But the world has really been changing. And while that $25 was enough to draw many livestock farms to the Midwest, where it could be better integrated with cropping production systems, when we look at some of the government programs that are out there, specifically things like the RIN market, which is a market controlled by the EPA to develop basically transportation fuels, which compressed natural gas made from renewable sources can qualify for, or things like the low carbon fuel standard, especially driven out of California, Washington, and many of our Western coast states. Those carbon credits or carbon markets that we can start qualifying for give opportunities of anywhere from $150 up to $300 annually, sort of from that manure value. We tend to be on the lower side if we're starting with deep pit facilities, and we'll talk about that in more detail next time when we get into sort of carbon intensity scoring and what you might be able to expect. But all of a sudden, we woke up in a world where we used to think chasing this $25 value was what was drawing pigs to the Midwest, because that was an opportunity and a good reason to try and do business here, to a world where maybe some of these digester opportunities have been easier to implement in other states, where we've seen more outdoor lagoons rather than deep pit barns. And all of a sudden, we're in a situation where our manure might not be as valued as much. Certainly we're valuing the nutrients, but the draw is different for different locations. And I certainly love Iowa, and I love livestock production and think it plays an important role. So one of the things I want all of us to be thinking about is, what does that mean for livestock systems in Iowa? If that $25 was enough to draw them here, and that $150 to $300 per pig space is easier captured elsewhere, what do we do to make sure that Iowa plays in this realm and has opportunities to make sure that we continue to be cost competitive and try and feed the world? I did get a question about, will we make slides available afterwards? And yes, we will. If you're registered, you will get a chance to see the slides and download them later. All right, so really, what is anaerobic digestion? And it starts with taking any organic material. Certainly, I tend to think in terms of livestock manure or agricultural residues and compounds, corn stover, soybean stover, potentially cover crops, basically biomasses. But it can take lots of other things. It could take municipal waste. It could take things from bioprocessing facilities, sugary wastewater from, for instance, Coca-Cola or a food processor, and all the stuff that comes with them, right? So in manures, that might be things like pathogens or macronutrients like nitrogen, phosphorus, or potassium. But it's really that unstable organic matter, that carbon, that's of most interest to us. And that's really the input. And what we're trying to do that is put it in a tank and store it in a certain way that limits air intrusion. So we don't want oxygen in there, essentially. And then we need to get a population of microbes that can do their stuff on this and break it down. And what comes out then is something that we'd call treated effluent, right? And in many ways, it's not that different from the manure we start with. There'll be less organic matter, less carbon in it. But for the most part, the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium that we start with pass right through. And that's both a blessing and a curse, right? If we were thinking about, can anaerobic digestion change nutrients on my farm, right? Can it work as a nutrient treatment system so that I don't have as much manure to apply, or I don't need as much land? It's probably not accomplishing that goal for us. On the other hand, if we're in the Midwest and we're thinking about manure as a fertilizer product, treating it through an anaerobic digester doesn't do much to reduce the fertilizer value, right? It still has all that nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And what it's really done is move some of it to be more available right away when we take it out of the digester. And that can be an opportunity for us. The other thing that we tend to see is it's a great tool for reducing pathogens in the manure. And that's not something we tend to regulate on, but it is something that I think people are concerned about. Where are these pathogens in the manure? What's the risk to people or the environment? And having something we can do on farm to reduce that number can be beneficial. I've been working on some research projects here with antibiotic resistant bacteria, and we see a similar trend that treating in an anaerobic digester, for whatever reason, seems to lower the amount of antibiotic resistant bacteria that remain in the manure. As I mentioned, it's still nutrient rich, or at least as nutrient rich as it was. We can do more sophisticated things to try and capture sludge, and we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail today to try and make a better fertilizer product, or at least different fertilizer products. But that stuff coming out is relatively nutrient rich. And then maybe just as importantly, it's moderately stabilized, right? We've gotten rid of a lot of that organic matter, and that tends to be a source of odors. So in doing that, we hopefully end up with something that has at least a lower odor risk for the neighbors or people around us. And then I saw one of the interests was really in energy production, and that's what we're doing here, right? Or at least trying to do. That process by breaking it down with microbes without oxygen around, we reduce everything. All those carbon molecules go from things like carbohydrates, fats, lipids, down towards a breakdown pathway of methane. And we can use that methane to replace natural gas. We can combust it for electricity. It has pathways where we can use it. And that's really the driver for doing this, right, is to try and develop that product. The other thing it tends to make in relatively high volumes is carbon dioxide. And that's just where oxygen that was inherent in those carbohydrates ends up, right? It has to go somewhere, and it's making another a product for us there. And that carbon dioxide historically has been something that we vent to the atmosphere as we clean gas, or if we're burning the biogas for electricity, it gets released to the atmosphere. Certainly there are other potential markets for it, but as of right now, that's really where we've been. And then there are some trace gases that can come off. The most important one to us is really hydrogen sulfide. The amount of hydrogen sulfide you make, there's various ways to treat and control it, anywhere from bleeding in small amounts of oxygen to that digester to sort of oxidize the sulfur, so it's not hydrogen sulfide, all the way to picking it up in our gas cleaning system with something like an iron sponge. But it is something that we're going to make a little bit more of, and it's really ration or diet dependent how much sulfur you start with, what that risk level is going to look like. There's lots of things that control methane generation, but really it's a flow pathway, at least, right? We start with these more complex materials, proteins, fats, carbohydrates, and the first process that we go through is something called hydrolysis. Really, it's bacteria secreting enzymes out that do some basic fermentation to try and break those molecules down into smaller and smaller sizes. So for proteins, that might be flows and breakdowns into something like an amino acid. For fats, it's breaking them down into smaller fatty acids, and those carbohydrates end up as sugars. The next step is really acidogenesis, and then acetogenesis is really taking those things and turning them into volatile fatty acids where possible, so carbonic acids, or eventually trying to turn them into something like acetic acid. And for the most part, the first steps are handled by a slew of bacteria that we might think about, right? And each one might be more tailored to break down a protein, or more tailored to break down a fat. But there tends to be a lot of different types of bacteria that can do those processes. As we get to the end, the final step is turning that acetic acid into methane. And those bacteria tend to be much more limiting. They are called methanogens, and they can be bacteria or archaea. But the important part there is they tend to be much more sensitive. So they tend to grow slower. Just there's not as much energy to be gained from the reaction. So it just takes a little bit more effort or time. And the point I wanted to make here is this is a natural process. If we're storing manure in a deep pit manure storage, or if we're storing it in a lagoon or a slurry store, we're always having this process go on. Anything that basically puts us in an anaerobic condition is going to have some anaerobic digestion happening. When we say, what is an anaerobic digester? What we really are trying to say is, well, we're trying to control this process to be more productive and do something where we're capturing that biogas and using it. So the amount of methane that you make is dependent on lots of things, sort of what you start with. And I'm going to say that's related to the volatile solids content of the material we added, which is a code word for just how much carbon does it have in it, or organic matter. And then there's some quality factor of that organic matter. Just like you might tailor your diet to consume different things because of what they do, right? We might want more protein, or we might want more fiber. Digesters think the same way. Some of that stuff is easier to break down, some of it's harder to break down, and what we might call that is biodegradability, right? And then the last ones are really things that we can do to sort of alter our breakdown, right? We can think about, what are those storage conditions? Are we mixing? Are we not mixing? What temperature are we keeping at and how long is it in this vessel where we're trying to perform that action? So all those things change how much methane we might be able to generate, but they don't change the inherent properties of the material. I wanted to cover some processing advantages and maybe some disadvantages of anaerobic digestion. And the first one is that it can be messy, right? So non-sterile reaction vessels. And you might say, well, that doesn't sound like a huge advantage to me. But if you work in the world of manure, it really is, right? It's loaded with bacteria to start with. And thinking about getting to a pure single strain is extremely difficult. So when we compare what we're doing with maybe something like ethanol production, where they have that single stream and they need sterile reaction vessels to avoid off products, well, we don't have to do that, right? We can take dirty stuff and really get that treatment. Another big advantage we have is automatic product separation. So when we see some of those ethanol plants and they're doing distillation and have big columns and need to add lots of heat, we don't have to do that necessarily, right? The gas, that methane, is basically insoluble in water, so it's going to naturally off gas from that material, and we get this natural product separation. Now, if we want to make it pure enough to put in a pipeline, certainly we have to do some post-processing of that gas, but at least our initial separation is relatively simple. And the other thing that I think has historically been appealing is its relatively simple equipment and operations. Now, certainly there are things that can go wrong. I'm not trying to say it will always go perfectly, and there's definitely things that we can do to optimize the situation. But it is a process that occurs naturally. In a deep pit barn, where our swine manure is falling through the slats stored in that pit, there is methane coming off of that manure continuously. So really, when we say, can you mess up a digester? You can, but as long as you keep it within relatively open criteria, the process is going to occur. The art, or at least the science behind it, is really the optimization part, is where people make their money and do better. Some of the disadvantages of anaerobic digestion is reactions are actually really, really slow. And I'm going to have you a slide for you where we compare this to some other potential processing techniques. And it takes a while, and that means we need bigger tanks, bigger storage, and building a big tank costs more money than building a small tank, right? So that is a drawback, but it is something that, maybe given the simplicity of the process, we're willing to live with. Methane yields do tend to be relatively low. So if we consider something like starting with corn grain and turning it into ethanol, the corn grain itself has a lot of energy in it. And for the most part, the stuff we tend to process in digesters don't look like that, right? It looks like a manure where you have lots of water, or it looks like something that's already been consumed by an animal, processed once, and we're trying to treat it a little bit more. So we tend to have lower methane yields. That doesn't universally have to be true. It depends on what we're starting and taking in, but it is something we see. And then the last one is really turning that sulfur into hydrogen sulfide. Mostly that tends to be an issue in terms of treating and removing that hydrogen sulfide. There are some safety risks associated with hydrogen sulfide and confined spaces, so it's something we have to be aware of. But really, from an operation standpoint, the risk is really more, how do we get it out of the gas and get the gas clean enough to use? I promised you a little bit on process and how long it takes, and just a couple to compare it to. So if you think about traditional corn grain ethanol fermentation, that's about a 2-day process, give or take, right? So relatively quick. If we think about making biodiesel, that might be a 2-hour process, right? So again, super rapid. In terms of anaerobic digestion, where it's a much slower fermentation, if you start with something really easy, like a sugary wastewater and a sophisticated digester, you might be able to get your reaction time down to the order of 8 hours or so. If we start talking like, how long does it take manures to digest, we might be in that 20 to 100 day window, with 20 to 30 days probably being what we've typically chosen. As we think about alternative feedstocks, for example, like corn stover or prairie grasses or cover crops, we have much less experience in that. Certainly it starts us down that road, but some of those products might take more time to degrade depending on sort of the makeup of what's there. One of the things that you'll probably hear a fair amount about if you start studying anaerobic digesters is we have to figure out how much gas we're going to make. And there's a couple ways to do that, but one of the most common is something called the biochemical methane potential. And essentially it just measures the digestibility of a substrate. So you start with some inoculum, which is a fancy way of saying, hey, I have this anaerobic digester and I took some stuff out. You make mini reactor vessels, put a small amount of whatever substrate you're testing in, and then somehow measure the amount of gas and methane that you're making, right? So this is just an example of how we do it in my lab. You see an incubator where we're storing it at 35 degrees Celsius, and then we monitor those bottles periodically based on how much methane we think they're going to make, measuring the volume of the gas with this graduated slurins and running it through an infrared methane analyzer. This is just a completely mixed digester I run in my lab to keep a source of inoculum. I'm feeding it dog food. We had a question about, are there environmental issues with H2S in the gas? Don't you want to keep the sulfur in the liquid? We'd love to keep the sulfur in the liquid. And there are some ways to do that. I mentioned one earlier. You can bleed in small amounts of oxygen or air to try and reoxidize that sulfur and put it back in the liquid. And then there's some other ways to treat it. One that's relatively common is using an iron sponge on that gas cleanup side. So the sulfur essentially reacts with the iron and we can pull it out of the gas. We really don't want to off-gas H2S if we can help it on our processing system. Certainly, when we've looked at cropping systems in Iowa, there's a demand for that sulfur, right? So we often talk about nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, but sulfur is the fourth most valuable compound in manure. So we want to keep as much of it in the liquid as we can. And even though I'm mentioning hydrogen sulfide and saying there's issues with it, when we think about what fraction of sulfur is coming out as hydrogen sulfide in the gas, it's still actually relatively small. We just want that gas to be relatively pure when we put it in the pipeline. And it can cause some corrosion issues on the back end is sort of why we worry about it. The human health issues tend to be more of a concern at higher levels. So I tend to think of a higher level as 25, 50 parts per million. And the truth is, while that can happen in a confined space around a digester, for the most part, anywhere downwind of that digester, the levels aren't going to be high enough to be an issue. There are some government reporting if you're a non-agricultural entity on hydrogen sulfide emissions, but absolutely, people are trying to keep as much of it in the digester liquid as they can and minimizing what's in the gas, because cleaning it out of the gas can be a more expensive part of the cleanup process. I wanted to give you an example of what you can learn from running some of those BMPs. So this was just a swine feeding trial we did here at Iowa State. We fed 3 different rations. So that's sort of what that middle designator would be. SBM would be corn soybean meal rations, right? So that would have been what we considered a typical ration before we had distiller's grain. Corn DDGS, that would be corn with the distiller's grain in the ration. And then corn SH would be corn with soy hulls as a ration. Not as common, but in that case, we wanted to see what fiber was doing. So we fed a different fiber relative to that corn distiller's grains. The designator on the end is just a designator for how we were grinding the diet, either coarse, which is about 700 microns, or fine, which is 350 microns. And really the swine industry has moved towards that finer grind because it improves feed digestibility by the pig. And what I wanted to illustrate here is a couple things. One, feeding distiller's grains, right, tends to increase the amount of methane potential we have in swine manure. The other thing to note is that by grinding finer and getting better digestibility in the pig, we end up with less in the manure, right? So it's certainly, if we're feeding pigs, that's what we want. But if you're showing up and saying, I want to run a digester on this manure, how much gas am I going to make? As we do better with pig performance and feed improvements, we're probably going to have less potential coming out of that pig in terms of what's left in the manure. There's another way to do it, and for a first really quick test, chemical oxygen demand is something that you can get many labs, commercial labs, to run for you. And we know that for every kilogram of chemical oxygen demand that you can break down in an anaerobic digestion process, you should make about 0.35 cubic meters of methane. So if you want to say, do I have a material that this even makes sense for, that's often a good place to start because it's a quick, easy test. The art really is in estimating how good we're going to do in removing that chemical oxygen demand during treatment in a digester. And that answer is it depends a lot on the quality of the organic material in it. If it's sugar water, you can probably get most of it to break down. If it's really lignocellulosic material with a lot of lignin, we aren't going to do as good a job of breaking it down. And that's where that biochemical test really can come in handy to help know a little bit better. And then I wanted to just show a few pictures as we got started. We'll hit these a little more in detail on our integrating on the farm. But there's really basically 5 processes that we're trying to handle, right? And that's feedstocks, both getting them to our digester and make sure they're pre-treated appropriately, talking through some digesters, and then some back-end handling for what's coming out, both the gas and the liquid. So as we think about layout on a farm and what we might be doing, this will certainly depend on what your farm looks like and your overall goals, but we might need something for our storage of other materials coming in. We have to somehow get our manure into this digester, depending on what we're adding, especially if we're adding other materials. We might need to do some post-separation, right, and generate some of the solids and liquids and keeping them separate, have to store the liquids somewhere. And then really what we're trying to do is get that gas to our gas cleanout system. In this case, we created a clean and dirty entry in our example, just because as we talk through some of this in our future episodes, scale is going to be really important. And that might mean taking more materials than we have on our farm and making sure we do so in ways that are biosecure. I saw that most people had been to a farm with a digester, or at least half of them have, but I wanted to show some pictures of what that might look like. So the simplest digesters that we see people use in practice are really lagoons that are covered, right? So the upper left picture there is just a picture of a lagoon that was being constructed when I was there. Clay liner, you can see some tubes there on the bottom. Those are recirculation and mixing tubes. While not technically required, some people have suggested that mixing might increase methane production. And there are some advantages and disadvantages to potentially trying to do that. So that was a relatively large lagoon. I'm standing at the bottom and you can see the banks up at the top. As that gets completed, they're going to put an impermeable cover, which is basically a plastic film over the top, trench that into the bank to capture any gas that comes off. And that needs to be ballasted. You can see sort of the swells and where they come back down, and we're ballasting that to help with cover life and longevity so that it doesn't flap in the wind as much, and to aid with rainfall removal from the top of that cover. So the big advantage of this is if you already have an existing lagoon or manure storage, it's relatively low cost to implement. We don't have to build a new tank. We can just simply get a cover installed over the top of it, right? So it's really good at using some existing infrastructure. And then it separates the HRT, that hydraulic retention time, from the SRT, or the solids retention time. And really what we're trying to do in a digester is keep the organic matter in it as long as possible to give the bacteria more time to break it down. And in many ways, separating that hydraulic retention time and the organic matter retention time can be beneficial, right? We're going to keep the organic material in and let that water come out. The big disadvantages here are it's relatively slow conversion. Essentially, temperature is extremely important in these reactors, and given wherever you are in the US, you get the temperatures you get. So we tend to see these being more popular in warmer locations, with somewhere around I-80 being sort of the line of demarcation. As you go north of that, it's hard to get them to function as well. Not impossible, but a little harder to function. And then it's not uniform production. And what I mean by that is it's not uniform throughout the year. So if you think about, I need to size a gas cleaning system to take all the gas that's coming out, I might get most of my gas in 2 months with a lagoon, rather than relatively uniform over the course of a year with I had a heated digester. So I have to oversize my gas cleaning system, and that has a cost associated with it. So just some general process parameters there. They tend to need lower organic loading rates per unit of volume in the digester. We tend to want things that are relatively low in solids content, oftentimes less than 2%, and you need a longer retention time in these. More than 35 days, but down the order of 60 to 90 days is probably more practical in most locations. Another style of digester that we've seen be extremely popular is that completely mixed. And sort of the illustration of this is always stuff flowing in, stuff flowing out, with some sort of mixing apparatus in between. And while I show a propeller, oftentimes that's done with pumps, right? So here we can see a concrete tank, insulated, got a cover on it, mixing inside to keep things well agitated in it. The big advantage of these is we start to work with things that can have higher solids content in them. Generally, we think of up to around 10%, maybe to 12% solids, depending on the type of mixing you're using. And these have seen a lot of industrial use application or municipal use application. The disadvantage here is we do a relatively poor job of biomass immobilization, right? So we don't want stuff to settle out. We're trying to keep it mixed up there so that the whole reactor is more productive in making materials. And that tends to make the hydraulic retention time and the solids retention time exactly the same. So we don't get the advantage of separating the liquid from the solids and building our reactor a little smaller. They do tend to be heated, and that means we need shorter times. Probably 17 days or so is about the minimum you could potentially run a completely mixed reactor on, with somewhere around 30 days being the longest you'd probably run it on. They can handle a higher organic loading rate, which is a good thing, right? If we're loading it harder, we can get more gas per unit volume. And they have been one of the more commonly installed digesters on agricultural systems, especially as we move north where heating is required. Another style of digester is that plug flow digester. So in this case, it flows in and it flows out, but we tend to not have much mixing over the whole digester. We want to keep it separate. So this is an example of one being constructed before it's had its cover put on. Essentially, we're feeding at the far end. Material flows through essentially as a plug down to the near side of the picture, has to turn the corner, and then it will flow back out down towards the other side where we're going to pump it out. So they have a good track record of being used in agricultural situations, especially with scrape manure systems where we tend to be a little bit more on the thick side. They do require a thicker manure. Sort of, if you think about putting sand particles in water, they're going to fall through relatively quickly. If you would take those same sand particles and put them on something like ketchup, that's a lot thicker, we can keep that material suspended much longer, right? So that tends to be what we've been trying to do. And you say don't use with sand bedding. That seems strange after I just used sand as my example. Sand is not ever going to be our friend in a digester. If you are using sand, people often add some transverse mixing, so mixing along the way to try and resuspend some of those particles, and that is sometimes necessary. Sizing of material going in beforehand is really important if you have a digester where it has to get through some of these weirs and turn corners. Otherwise, you might see some plugging issues. And then the last thing I wanted to point out before we turn it over for benefits on anaerobic digestion is just sort of what efficiencies can you expect? For the most part, completely mixed and plug flow digesters in practice are somewhere between 70 and 85% efficient. So in terms of how much biochemical methane potential are we starting with compared to what they're making, that's generally a good goal to shoot for. Certainly you can do better or worse than these depending on your conditions, but that's typically where most of those would work. If you're using a lagoon style system, it's much more dependent on where you're at in the country. So we've tried to do some mapping of what you might expect. That blue number on the top would be if you had a lagoon that was only emptied once a year, you might be able to approach efficiencies of 60 or 70% as you get to warmer parts of the country. If you're doing something more typical where we're pumping manure out twice a year on a dairy lagoon, for instance, you might see your efficiency drop to something like 40%, right? So it does vary spatially based on region, and you can certainly do better or worse than that, but at least to give you an idea of where we're at, those would be some typical efficiencies that might be expected as you think about what digester would fit you well. With that, I'm going to stop talking for a minute and turn it over to Kapil, who is going to talk about some of the benefits from digesters.
Can you guys hear me okay?
I can hear you now, Kapil. Yep.
All right. Thanks, Dan. So I'm Kapil Arora. I'm a field agricultural engineer here with Iowa State University Extension. Work in central and north central Iowa, covering about 20 counties. Got some interest in anaerobic digestion. So today I'm going to talk to you guys about benefits of anaerobic digestion, especially the environmental and economic advantages. We're just going to take a 30,000 foot elevation look at these just to get everybody on the same page. So in livestock production, I typically put out this word cloud, and you can see sustainable agriculture kind of comes out, and uh, it's pretty bold in there. What is sustainable? We're typically talking about practices in agricultural and managing the resources within agriculture in such a way that we have long-term viability of our production systems, and at the same time, we are minimizing our environmental, economic, and social impacts. Sustainability, basically, in my mind, there is for very various reasons, long-term well-being for our resources, judicious use of those resources, and have as little waste that comes out of our systems, or just be energy efficient to the maximum possible. We are never going to be in a situation where our livestock systems are not going to produce organic waste coming out of them. So our objective through anaerobic digestion basically is we're going to try to reduce environmental pollution, which is better nutrient recycling through anaerobic digestion, and trying to get more diversified use of this resource so we can produce energy, produce a resilient substrate at the end, which we can use back in soil health for for our lands where we are actually going to land apply that digestate, and maybe even able to recycle some of that digestate back in with the system and the livestock for wash waters or other things based on what the or, organism counts on those waters are. So when we look at anaerobic digestion as a whole, definitely we have been traditionally looking into livestock waste and wastewater coming into the digester and getting digested, but some of the new ways coming into enhancing that rate of digestion or having some more sugars or easily digestible substrates in there, food waste can definitely help in that direction. Plus some of the biomass from crops, when there are more sugars in them, uh, like silage or other things, that can actually help the digestion process. Trying to get into the biogas production out of it, which is somewhat dirty, and then we have to get the hydrogen sulfide out of it, and then eventually get into the biomethane or compressed natural gas situations where it can be used as fuel or pressurized and actually put it back on the grid. Uh, Biogas can be cleaned out biogas, can be used for producing heat and electricity. And as Dan was showing his graphs, the rate of anaerobic digestion is impacted by your geographic location. The farther north you are into the cold climates. And in winter months, one, your rate of digestion is going to go down, but then also you may need some heat by burning that gas to keep the digester hot enough to produce the gas that is needed. And again, those numbers are variable based on where you are. And digestate is one thing that will come out of the digestion piece and can go back on the land as fertilizer, soil amendments, and the solids, if they are clean enough and don't carry any disease elements, can be used back as livestock bedding as well. Reducing the carbon footprint is one of the main questions around anaerobic digestion. Just to give you some background, livestock globally is producing about 15% of anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. Manure management comprises of about 5%, and they don't look like large numbers, but if you look at what some of our large food producing companies here in the US have pledged, Smithfield is at 30% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. JBS Foods is actually 30 by 2030, but net zero by 2040. Nestle is 20 by 2025, 50 by 2030, and net zero by 2050. And if you just look at manure as 5% of that 30%, that's almost 1/6 of what they are pledging. So 5% may not look like a big number otherwise, but out of their total pledges, it becomes a relatively bigger number. Where is this footprint? Just giving you an example of swine. If we are managing manure in outside lagoons, Our methane production per head per year is around 22, 23 kilograms. But from that storage, we are also getting nitrous oxide, which is around 0.2. And for both of them, the equivalent carbon dioxide is 625. You guys can do this math yourself. Also, typically, methane is used as 21 times the CO2 equivalent. So you multiply the methane number by 21, and then nitrous oxide is 298. I sometimes just use 300 for easy figuring. Uh, if you switch the storage system to deep pits, the methane production does go down, and it's further reduced if you got a bedded pack. So based on what kind of manure storage system you have, its carbon footprint is different, and it's going to produce different CO2 equivalents from both methane and nitrous oxide. Bedded pack does actually increase the amount of nitrous oxide being given off those manure packs. If we actually get down into pounds that is fed to an animal, and we're just giving you a swine example here for a wean to finish pig, and you take in how many pounds we are feeding that pig total per day or on a given time period, we can actually calculate out what is the amount of methane that is being produced in a lagoon if that is our only storage methodology. There's enough research done on concentrations coming off of these legumes and analysis on manure that is being fed, where there's fair good confidence in these numbers. We're almost producing around 27 pounds methane as carbon going up from a manure storage structure. We definitely are producing 12.5 pounds of CO2 as well through the microbial respiration that's happening in the lagoon. But if we take the same system and now actually put up a cover on top of that manure storage structure and capture the methane, given the way these covers work, uh, there is some leakage through them, but we are able to capture almost 25 pounds methane uh, out of what was being otherwise given up or just gasifying up to the atmosphere. So that's a pretty good capture on the methane just by getting those lagoons covered. And then from there on, the digestate can then go into another storage structure where it is stored till it is land applied. While it is stored, there is some pass through on the carbon down into that storage structure. And we do get some methane come off of it too, but not as high if it was just straight manure going into a manure storage lagoon itself. So there are reduction potentials that exist. Yes, definitely the cover is going to cost. Uh, but as we go through this digestion, few things on nutrient management that come along is digestion is going to increase nitrogen availability. Some of those proteins, amino acids are going to break down and become more readily available nitrogen forms. So when we look at this effluent, it is a complete fertilizer, but it not necessarily a balanced one based off of what the crop intake is. Um, since the nitrogen availability is going to increase, timing does become a important factor with it. We want to make sure manure is applied correctly, it's distributed out properly, so it's used up. But more into springtime application or more closer applications to when the plant actually is needing that fertilizer. There's research going on here in Midwest where we are actually looking at applying liquid manures and digestates to growing crop, especially corn, and utilizing the same nutrients over over more acres. As we go through this process, there are more costs that we have to cover. Definitely, lagoons going to cost, and then methane capture equipment is going to cost. But there are revenue generation opportunities also. There can be tipping fees that can be looked at. There is money if we are actually producing energy from the direct sale of that energy. And if we are selling the digestate out for fertilizer, there can be actually income generated off of that digestate as well. Uh, in the market, definitely there are carbon credits, RINs, and as we are avoiding methane production and nitrous oxide production, we can actually get some of these credits. Carbon credits are out on the open market through different registries. Uh, there are people working, and I think there's few on our call here as well who are working with projects to get these carbon credits registered, verified, and then working with large production houses to help them meet their commitments on reducing their carbon footprints. Uh, these exist for just capture of methane and just flaring it, but then they're different for energy production versus if you are doing compressed natural gas and injecting it into the pipeline. EPA is running the Renewable Identification Number System, the RINs, and they basically are offering D3, D5, or D7 RINs based off of how the project is set up. But definitely there is revenue in carbon credits. Uh, more and more of the open registries are now looking at their contracts and putting in clauses that if you are taking carbon credits in one project, you cannot sell the same credits in another registry. Just not trying to be double dipping the same credits in different projects. Digestion can also come into play for odor reduction as well. If you got open lagoons, that can lead up to complaints and sometimes can be nuisance to neighbors. And we have seen in certain situations where legal action has come into play. Where do these odors come from? Livestock by itself, about half odor units per pig space per second can be emitted. Manure itself could be another source. That's another half odor units per meter square per second being emitted, roughly around 3 meter cube per pig. And what else can produce odor? If we are dealing with new materials into anaerobic digestion, some of the grasses and other biomass that we may add, we just do not have enough research or data available to them what those digested solids at the end are going to be. In cases there has been reports that digested solids actually have more odors coming off of those than what the typical livestock and manure digestion biomass is at the end of digestion. But overall, anaerobic digestion does help reduce odors. We do have an AMPAT tool. This is Air Management Practices Assessment tool. It just talks about different practices on manure storage and handling, such as landscaping, composting, aeration of the stored manure and store structure, manure additives, permeable covers. And if you're interested in it, it kind of gives you a ranking and lets you know under its 3 color codes whether it is low impact, medium impact, or high impact towards odor control. Pretty handy tool, has been used here several times. So how does anaerobic digestion really reduce odor? It is basically taking those volatile organic carbons and shifting the chemistry by the processes that Dr. Andersen was describing earlier, more into CO2, carbon dioxide, and methane production. So we are not going down the path of producing some of the highly odorous compounds which may get produced just by uh, manure being stagnant or just being stored, and that anaerobic digestion is not happening. It does increase ammonia production as well as hydrogen sulfide production. So there is research definitely needing on those pieces to help those things not be produced as much or keeping them in the liquid part of things. And as that happens, we can put impermeable covers on top and capture the methane that's coming off of it. So one, by doing the digestion, we are changing some of that volatile organic carbon chemistry. And then by putting the cover on it, we are actually taking and not letting the gases just discharge freely up into the atmosphere, thus basically reducing the odor transfer. Last thing I do want to cover here is we do have some soil health improvement benefits as well on the tail end of the anaerobic digestion, where we have this biomass that's left at the end. Uh, it's mostly rich in lignin and other materials that cannot be easily digested, and it has the potential to improve soil organic matter. And we typically are looking at land application of this material. We can further compost it and maybe get down into that phase. But if you have land readily available to you, uh, you typically want to be land applying that, as that would be your least cost option. There is research available. This is on the right hand side is from Scottsbluff, Nebraska, which has shown that if we are applying more total carbon, it does over application rate does tend to increase the soil organic carbon. Now, it does help in getting stable aggregates in the soil form because you are adding soil organic matter, which is basically leading into uh, more organic and humic acids, which tend to bind soil particles together, which in turn leads up to better and stable soil aggregates, and thus giving or improved soil health. Typically, we get more water holding capacity. There's more enzymatic and activity in the soil itself, which overall leads to better plant health. Digesters will influence how things are managed on the farm as well, because if we are trying to get biomass crops back into uh, the digesters, we will have to allocate acres to produce those biomass crops, which can lead into changes in crop rotation. And then on the tail end, if we are taking residue after crop harvest, in cases where there is too much biomass available, uh, in Midwest here, we are getting into high corn productivity where we do have large amount of residue left at the end, and farmers are wanting to find ways to use it. So that stover at the end can be taken off and used up, uh, but it will change how that entire regime exists and what that management strategy is. And then in the end, instead of just applying manure, we are bringing that effluent back and applying it, which also is going to change the soil health components of the entire system. So overall, digesters are beneficial. They are a better environmentally friendly application. Definitely economics plays a big role into it. So just giving you a quick overview, and I'm gonna at this point pass it back to Dr. Andersen.
Perfect. Thanks, Kapil. As we're running short on time, if you are willing, please either scan that QR code or go to the web link posted to fill out our voluntary demographic survey, which we are required to do as part of our USDA project supporting this webinar series. So I'll give you a minute to do that, and then I'll try and answer some questions here. I see the last question was related to what are some ways to reduce ammonia volatilization, and rightfully pointed out the digester converts that organic nitrogen into ammonical nitrogen. And in addition to doing that, it also tends to give us a more basic pH in our manure storage after our effluent storage after digestion as compared to before. Both things that can make us more prone to nitrogen loss during storage after digestion than if we hadn't performed digestion at all. And that is certainly something that I apparently didn't actually click share. There we go. Now you should be able to see the QR code. Thank you. So both those things can enhance ammonia volatilization. There are some strategies that people can use to try and reduce the amount of ammonia volatilization they have post-digester storage. Certainly, we talked about those covered storages. We have seen some companies that are completely covering their manure storages post-digestion to capture any remaining biogas that might be produced, and that can help with that ammonia volatilization. There are some challenges with that. It can get rather large and costly to cover that storage compared to saying, I'm just going to build a covered storage that only had 90 days of effluent storage in that. It also makes it a lot harder to think, how am I going to agitate this storage in the future, get solids removal? And next time we'll cover a little bit about some of the trade-offs of that. I have some pictures of what happens if you don't solid separate, especially if you're doing things like adding biomass crops and sort of the crust that you could develop. But that is one way to potentially do it, noting that there's some trade-offs. You could look at things like acidification. That's a technology that Europe has really pushed to try and minimize ammonia losses during storage. Again, it comes with a trade-off, right? We have to buy some form of acid, use a concentrated acid, and that has some safety concerns in our different manure storages. But there are some mitigation approaches. There are simpler things like putting an impermeable cover on top of your manure storage. ISU has used LECA on one of our manure storages. So that's lightweight expanded clay aggregate. Essentially, it's clay that's been popped like popcorn so it floats, trying to provide sort of a partial cover. They make plastic materials, balls and hexagons that you can put on to achieve similar things. And then some people have chopped up corn stover to put it on. Certainly all those have concerns or challenges associated with them. And as Kapil mentioned, one of the things that you might look at is, can I just simply try and apply my manure more frequently, especially during that growing season, using some pieces of modern technology to limit storage size so that we don't have maybe just as long to lose ammonia post digesters. And then the last thing I wanted to point out on that is, and we'll try and talk about this more next time, is maybe when does solid liquid separation work? When do we have to start thinking about nutrient separation? Because as we look at some of the economies of scales that might be necessary, sort of the Iowa model of we're going to build a farm and for the most part have cropland reasonably close to it to make this facility sort of have a nutrient budget may or may not be as applicable when we start thinking about what does it take to make a digester facility cash flow. And especially as we get large, some of those treatment systems might start to make more sense. And in some ways that makes me sad, right? It's a very different version of manure nutrient utilization, but it opens up some opportunities as well. But those might be things that we need to do. I did want to acknowledge our funding for this webinar series comes from the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Services under that federal award number right there. And you can see our non-disclosure. I believe we've opened it up. So if you have questions at this time, you should be able to unmute and ask questions. But I did want to plug that next time we plan on talking about project economics, diving into some of those details about carbon credits and incentives, and especially talking about scaling projects to be successful. As one of the challenges we're going to have is how big do these facilities need to be, and how do we help make that a reality if this is a goal we're going to try and work towards? So happy to try and adjust some questions. If you have them, feel free to both type them in the chat or to unmute and ask them. I see we got a question that they're dealing with a digester that uses food waste and manure as feedstocks. The digestate out of the AD goes to some ponds, and the agency is requiring them to do some testing on some compounds. Whew. All right, I will follow up on that one later, David. I think I do have your contact and email from the registration, so we'll make sure I follow up about that one later. That definitely sounds like a tough situation, and I think it's something that as we think about taking other materials, we're going to get asked more, right? So when you look at many of those air regulations and what's been required in the past, they've been written specific to livestock facilities and how we're storing it. And as you take other materials, it is going to get questioned, right? And I think while we know that digesters for the most part will reduce volatile organic compounds, certainly taking different food waste could have higher nitrogen and lead to differences in protein content and ammonia and sulfur emissions. We do have data that we could compare to based on what your ammonia and sulfur contents are in the liquid relative to what occurs in livestock manures to make a first estimate, but some of those monitoring techniques do get a little bit more complicated. So I'm going to go back to the voluntary demographic survey, but again, say thank you for those of you who joined us. We promised to let you out of here after an hour, and we've reached that time limit. I appreciate the questions you had and for filling out our survey. Next time, we'll be addressing some of those economic issues, and hopefully that will be of interest to all of you. So hope to see you all in about a month. If you have any last-minute follow-up questions, feel free to hang around. I will try and stay to address some as we open up. But thank you, everyone, for joining.